I do think there are some important issues that aren't altogether on the table, and while I don't want to divert us from the concern with behavior and evolutionary biology and the behavioral economics that you've been talking a lot about and that is a backdrop for this, I do want to suggest that that can distract us from what I think is the central issue of climate change in the modern world, which is, first of all, you might say, a public good and a public issue. And this follows nicely on the public-private venture and investment discussion we just had briefly, because I think often as we talk about individual behavior and group behavior and investment and market approaches to changing how we deal with climate change, we forget the fundamental political questions. If you were to draw that little diagram of a box inside of which you have affect on the one hand and analytic on the other, cognition and rationality on the one hand, irrationality on the other, self-interest on the one hand, and altruism on the other, and try to just stay there, you would miss the fact that that box, the little black box of the individual, sits inside of a large political and social and civic world defined by class, power, gender, politics, and conflict. And that unless we face up squarely to those issues, nothing we do, valuable as they may be, as individuals and groups, to modify our behavior, to try to have the kind of zero-impact man influence on the world, is likely to change very much. So I want to take the few minutes I have here and suggest what some of the political dimensions are, not to take away from the discussion, but to supplement and add to the discussion a vital civic and political layer that I think we also need to think about and talk about as we come up with a communication strategy, an investment strategy, a war room strategy, and so on, because I think the ultimate issue here is politics. I am a political scientist, I confess, but politics looks very different than psychology. And it does look not at what we think and how we think it and how we communicate what we think, but rather the externals of power and influence that shape what and how we think, sometimes even coerce how and what we think. And unless we're looking at those forces, which we identify with power, influence, coercion, and understand them, to simply think of this as a problem of knowledge, correct knowledge, getting the thinking straight, and then communicating the thinking to people, I think we're going to have a problem. So I want to talk not just about psychology, but about politics, not just about knowledge, but about interest, not just about what is in the mind, but what pushes, shapes, and sometimes coerces the mind, not just about the right and wrong view, the scientific and unscientific view, but rather the fundamental conflict of interests that doesn't depend just on what we know. There are many people in this society and around the world who understand perfectly well what climate change is and may even accept the science, who oppose efforts to regulate climate change for reasons that have to do with their interests, their background, their class, or the impact of regulations on them. And if we simply think we just have to go out and explain to them what it's really about in order to fix things, we will not get the solution. Explanation is only one part of what is necessary here. And let me start with a little dilemma that we were talking about a little earlier. And a lot of people, including me, were kind of shocked to find out that if you do polling right, if you ask the right questions, it turns out that somewhere between 70 and 80% of Americans support most of the things that we in this room support. They have the right knowledge and so on. And by the way, I think if you did that in Congress, you might get, well, maybe 40 or 50%, not 80%, but you'd probably get the majority. But here's the question that I want to ask about that. How is it that if 80% of Americans value climate control, understand the need for climate regulation, want to promote sustainability, that a government that is in the hands of a large majority of the Progressive Democratic Party has not done one single thing on climate change this year and looks like it probably won't? How is it that if 80% of Americans believe deeply that something needs to be done, the American government, under the leadership of a Democratic president, same party as Al Gore, went to Copenhagen empty-handed, and that we came up empty at Copenhagen. How is that possible? That is about political failure, not about epistemological failure, what we know, or even how we communicate. It means there is a disconnect between what we know, even what we value and cherish, and what we are capable of doing in the political system to make change. And until we understand how to do that, it seems to me that despite the remarkable and unique and terrific ideas I've heard today coming out of this room that you're all engaged in, you are unlikely to make much of a political difference, which means we will continue to be not in the majority, as we are in the polling, but in the minority with respect to what we achieve politically on climate change. Let me suggest a few quick responses, answers to my own question. How can it be that 80% believe this, but we are so politically inept, so unable to move forward? And the first, I'm just going to, there are 4 points I want to make. The first is what I'll call the triumph of neoliberalism. The second is the paradox of participation and power. The third is the challenge of limited sovereignty in an interdependent world. So even when you get a democratic politics that does something, no one country can actually deal with the issue. And the fourth is the persistence of global inequality. Let me just say a word about each of those, put them on the table. I can't, obviously, in the time I have here, go fully into each of them, but I put the triumph of neoliberalism first because in a way it's the most important. Because the simple fact we all know is that climate justice, the regulation of climate, environmental sustainability are in their essence archetypically public goods. They're not private goods. They can be, but for most people, particularly people of wealth, people of privilege, like the people in this room, it's not really a big deal. Rising oceans build an ark, build a dike. Move from your yacht on Long Island to your place in Aspen. You'll be fine. It's a public, not a private good, which is to say it's a shared, it is a common good. It is a matter of the commonwealth. And we have now lived for 30 or 40 years in a country in which a new, powerful, conservative, call it neoliberal paradigm has triumphed in both parties. And that paradigm says something like the following. It starts with Ronald Reagan. Government is the problem, markets are the solution. Less government means more liberty. Less government means more efficiency. Less government means a solution to our problems. Government just can't do it. Now, in the 80s, that was kind of radical. It went up against the 30s and the 60s, against the New Deal and the Great Society. And in the 80s, the Democrats took it on. But by the late 80s, the Democratic Party had bought in. The Democratic Leadership Council said, stop fighting business. Stop fighting the private sector. We have to learn the merits and virtues of privatization. And in fact, President Clinton, with whom I worked, was basically a DLC man and a market man. He believed in making markets work. You know that he dismantled welfare, but more importantly, he dismantled federal regulation of the new digital media, leading to the new monopolies and so on that we have today. President Obama, I'm sorry to say, is a market man. He's not being misled by an economic team he didn't intend to have. He has said over and over again in the campaign, in his choices of Austin Goolsbee, in his choices of this economic team, and he said it again last October, right after the General Assembly, he said, I believe in markets and the job of government is to make markets work, period. President Obama took public option off the table, and he took it off the table because he doesn't really care about or believe in the public. He said, fine, you don't want a public option, no problem. We get rid of it. In doing that, he reinforced, undergirded the neoliberal line that not just government is the problem, but public is the problem.